Welcome, everybody. We're going to start in just a minute. Give folks a chance to join. In the meantime, welcome, and please put your name and your organization and why you're here in the chat. And we'll start in just a minute.
Hello, everyone from Mexico.
Hello, welcome. Please put your name in the chat and your name and what you do in the chat and why you're here. And we'll start in just a minute. All right, everybody, welcome from the Solutions Journalism Network, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting newsrooms and journalists cover solutions to social problems. I'm Jessel Noor, Democracy Cohort Manager at SJN. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to join us for this conversation. And we promise to pack in as much useful information in this next hour as possible. We're going to hear from three great experts dropping knowledge about economic democracy, and we'll have tons of time for you to take your questions, and we'll be creating a printable guide based on today's conversation. Please enter your name and what you do and why you're here in the chat. And as you have questions throughout this conversation, please share them in the chat and we will answer them. So why are we here? It feels like the world is heading towards calamity in terms of climate change, democracy, housing, the economy, you name it. But it's our journalistic duty to tell the whole story and to report on solutions and not just the problems we're facing. And we're here to help you, give you tools and ways of thinking of solutions to some of those problems. Also, SJN is closing its labor cohort, where 10 US-based newsrooms produce rigorous, evidence-based reporting on what's working to address systemic labor problems. Many of these responses are at the intersection of economy and democracy, and so there's these worlds of SJN's initiatives overlap. And we're excited to bring together newsroom partners like Next City and Prism, which is part of the labor cohort. You'll hear from some of their editors and reporters in a few minutes, along with Aria and Make With to share insight and expertise around this work. The goal is to give you a basic understanding of this concept to inform your solutions journalism and specific strategies for reporting and sourcing these stories. We'll have panelists share for about 10 minutes each, which will take us to about 30 minutes after the hour, and then we'll have a Q&A. And this will be recorded without the video squares of participants. And as I mentioned, we'll be creating a reporting guide based on this afterwards, which you will get in your inbox. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our first speaker. Aria Jougin is the founder and principal of Make With, a participatory design firm working to cultivate more justice and democracy within economic, media, and educational ecosystems. They're based in Portland, Oregon, and organized nationally around issues of economic democracy, design justice, and transformative education, and are affiliated with Design Justice Network, Zebras Unite, and the Oregon New Economy Project. Aria, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jessel. So glad we can make this happen. So I'd love to kick things off with a quick and dirty overview of what economic democracy is all about and why it's a useful framework for sourcing solution stories. But before I get into the meat of things, I think it's important to talk a little bit about what is at stake in this conversation. At this point, And as you mentioned, Jessel, we recognize that we in the US and worldwide are experiencing a series of profound, interconnected social, economic, and environmental crises, and that these are only continuing to intensify. I also have confidence that as solutions journalists and solutions-focused folks from other professions, you all are invested in helping us collectively address these crises, and you understand how and what we report on has a role to play in this. So in addition to all of the shifts that you're making in sourcing and reporting on your stories to incorporate a solutions perspective, it's important to recognize the way that larger editorial categories impact the public's understanding of certain concepts. In this case, we're concerned about the concepts of economy and the concept of democracy. As a society, we hold very narrow views of both these concepts, and a quick look at some of our most popular national news outlets in the US illustrates the way that these editorial categories both reflect and shape dominant understandings of these topics. So a quick screenshot from the homepage of the New York Times taken a few days ago shows us that the top level category here is business, right? And the fact that economy is a subcategory of business is extremely telling. Looking more closely at the stories themselves, we see all the usual suspects are represented: big business, manufacturing, markets, federal debt, and interest rates. And then turning to the topic of democracy, we can see on the front page of the Washington Post, also from a few days ago, that the high level category here is politics, within which sits democracy in America, and within which are exclusively stories about electoral politics. And as a reader, a lot is being communicated to me about what democracy is, where it happens, and by default, all the other places that it does not happen, right? And the same is true for economy in that New York Times example. And the truth is that both economy and democracy are conceptually and pragmatically more expansive than most people know. So the topics that tend to be reported on under economy or business, things like markets, wage labor, jobs, financial policy, are all just tips of the iceberg. Below the surface are all the other things we need and the systems we use to meet our material, our spiritual, and our social needs as a society. And at this point, it's very important to make a distinction between what an economy is generally and the very limited and specific topics that tend to come up when we talk about our economy. So this is where a broader definition of the category becomes useful. An economy is a socially constructed system that manages how we as a society generate, distribute, and exchange resources. Or put another way, the way that humankind copes with the problem of provisioning itself. With this definition in hand, we can see more clearly the wide range of activities and systems that make up any economy. And these things apply to our economy as well, right? So looking at this diagram, which I've borrowed from the solidarity economy movement and made a few modifications, we can see that an economy is inclusive of things like food and water, shelter, health, energy, education, and community, right? The things we need to exist. And it encompasses activities and systems we use to generate resources through ecological and cultural creation, to produce goods and services, to exchange and transfer these things, how we use and consume them, and what we do with the byproducts of these activities, mainly surplus and waste. And this more expansive definition of an economy is really essential because it points to a few things. One, the crises we're facing have to do with the way that our current system manages each of these activities, not just interest rates and employment. Two, it points to the fact that our economy is socially constructed. We have made choices, or choices have been made for us, about how we will handle each of these processes. And that means that different choices can be made, right? And then editorial and reporting and editorial categories have a role to play in illuminating this greater complexity and expansiveness, and highlighting the ways that people have been attempting to restructure our economy for more well-being. And this is where economic democracy and solutions reporting come in and come together. So economic democracy is a framework that communities use to reorganize social and economic life to better meet their needs through processes of shared decision-making, shared power, and shared management of resources. Sorry, shared ownership and shared management of resources. And there are a wide range of activities and models that fall under the larger umbrella of economic democracy. And each of those involves some degree, at least, of shared decision-making and or ownership. So some examples include cooperatives, of which there are many, many kinds in many industries, agricultural cooperatives, healthcare and childcare cooperatives, worker co-ops, housing co-ops. It includes things like community land trusts, which are another and a very specific model for community ownership and control of housing aimed at permanent affordability. It includes things like community-led planning processes where community members actually drive the community and economic development process. Credit unions, public banks, local currencies and time banks, which are another way that communities have worked to kind of keep value circulating locally and not be able to be extracted. Participatory budgeting, which is a process by which governments make a portion of municipal funds available for the public to make decisions about spending around. Public and cooperative utilities, which is how most of the US actually gets its power. Media and news cooperatives, and people-powered journalism, where democratic processes are incorporated into the reporting process itself. So these economic democracy solutions, of which there are many more, emerge from a wide range of ideologies and lineages, and there is no single authority or kind of entity to whom economic democracy belongs. But there are a few things that all of these projects tend to have in common. The first is that they emphasize shifting decision-making power and benefit, often financial benefit, but not exclusively, from a small group of stakeholders, owners, shareholders, et cetera, to a large group of stakeholders. Two, they are often implemented as a way of addressing patterns of exploitation, extraction, and displacement by prioritizing the opposite, right? Things like dignity, self-determination, sustainability, and accessibility, both for those who are involved in these projects directly, as well as the communities within which these projects exist. And finally, many of these projects emphasize redistributing that decision-making power and benefit for towards those who have been and continue to be excluded or denied access. So historically and presently marginalized communities, these kinds of solutions are a growing number of ways that folks in these communities are attempting to address their own challenges, right? So you may have already caught on to this, but there is a common belief at both the root of economic democracy solutions and solutions journalism. And that is the idea that those who are closest to a problem are the ones who are best equipped to come up with solutions. And this shared kind of understanding is part of what makes solutions journalism a natural approach to telling economic democracy stories, and why economic democracy stories are an important part of any kind of solutions-oriented agenda, right? So in practice, looking out for and telling economic democracy stories represent some really important shifts from the way that things have been done and are currently being done to some possible alternatives. So the first is about currently we think about labor, economy, and democracy as separate categories and separate beats, right? But using an economic democracy framing, we can see we're looking at the intersection of these things. The second is that when we keep all these categories separate, we unintentionally limit the public's understanding of where they should look for information about these ideas and where they should look for opportunities to engage and transform. And so again, an economic democracy framing helps expand the public's understanding of where labor, economy, democracy actually take place and where they might plug in and be a part of, meaningful solutions in their communities. And then finally, these conventional separation of categories tend to take for granted the systems that currently govern each sphere, right? We saw this in the New York Times and the Washington Post examples, but economic democracy framing helps us highlight projects that are attempting to actually transform these systems, to come up with new structures for how we answer these important economic questions as a society. So before I pass this off, there's just one more thing I want to share because I think it's really, really important. But there are a lot of projects out there that may be cooperatively owned or managed, but are not oriented towards justice. So as a model, as a business model, cooperative ownership is fundamentally about producing benefit for its members first, which means that you can have a cooperative of oil producers or bankers or white supremacists, right? And so it's really, really important as you're going out and looking for solution stories that you are both looking at the objectives of these projects and the outcomes of these projects, as well as the models that they're using to kind of replace the dominant economic model. So I just want to issue that as a word of caution, that co-op does not equal justice, but that many, many people are using these tools as part of a larger agenda around racial, economic, and environmental justice. So I'll leave it there and pass it back to you.
Aria, thank you so much for sharing your insight. If you have questions for Aria, please drop it in the Q&A or even the chat if you like. And if you drop it in the Q&A, Aria can start answering those questions, and then we'll address them after our next two panelists. So I want to introduce Oscar Perry Abello. He's the Senior Economic Justice Correspondent for Next City. And if you're already familiar with the world of economic democracy and the reporting on it, then you are almost certainly familiar with Oscar's fantastic work over the past several years. Oscar, turning it over to you. Oscar, are you there? Oh, Oscar cannot unmute. Let's try.
Okay, here I am.
Oh,
Sorry about that, everybody. All right, well, thank you, Jessel, for that introduction, and thank you, SJN, for the invitation to speak with you all today, and make with and Aria for organizing this and putting it all together. I know we do a lot of these webinars too at Next City, and I know it's a lot of work, and so
hey,
really
Oscar. Hey, Oscar,
Yeah.
We're having an issue with your sound, so why don't you reconnect, and in the meantime, we'll go to Ashton.
Well, is that better?
Oh, that is better, actually. Okay. Yeah, that's a
Right.
lot better. Thank you.
Sorry. Like I was just saying, thanks to Aria and SJN for organizing this. I know this is a lot of hard work to do, so because we do a lot of these webinars too at Next City. And before I kind of get into my presentation, let me just latch on to something Aria just mentioned at the end. Yeah, collectively owned, not necessarily social or economic, not necessarily equal to social or economic justice. There are more than 500,000 properties currently owned by real estate investment trusts, which are profit motivated, shareholder owned, often publicly owned, shareholder, traded on the stock market, kind of publicly owned entities. They were created in 1960, and today they're an increasingly larger force in the real estate industry. If you're a housing organizer out there, or if you've been reporting on housing issues, I'm sure you run into real estate investment trusts. And yeah, it's crazy that they own 500,000 properties across the US, and those are technically collectively owned, but they're not not for the benefit of communities necessarily, they're for the benefit of shareholders. They're profit motivated entities. Anyway, I'm just going to drop that. Okay, so a little bit about me first. Yes, I'm Perry Abello. Again, I use he, him pronouns. I was born here in New York City. I was raised in Philadelphia. So it was a really deep, dark secret that I was born here for a long time. But my parents are both Filipino immigrants. They came to New York City separately in the 70s. And I studied economics at Villanova University, so I don't have a traditional journalism kind of background. I studied the thing that I wanted to write about. And then I freelanced for a while, and while I was working, I had other day jobs until the Next City Fellowship rolled around, and this has been my path at Next City, and I'm currently based in New York City, where I live in the Washington Heights neighborhood. If you're familiar with Washington Heights. Next slide. A little bit about Next City, the publication I write for those who aren't familiar. We were established by urban planning students in 2003 as an all-volunteer publication. We have a big focus on reporting on solutions to advance social, racial, and environmental justice in cities. The idea of like cities, when 2003, it was still the time of cities being the places of pollution and crime and drugs and all the problems in society were in cities, and our founders wanted to look at cities and say, these aren't just the places or the sources of problems. These are the places where people have ideas and responses to all the problems. And so even back in 2003, before there was an SJN, Next City always sort of had this solutions kind of orientation or mindset, looking for like who's trying to address what's going on and where are they, and especially when it comes to cities. So with that in mind, next slide. So how does economic democracy show up for me in Next City? So pretty much in my time in Next City, I started in 2015. I've always been on the economic justice kind of beat. It's had different names. It's been called the equitable economic development beat, or I've been the economics correspondent, but today we really defined it as the economic justice beat. And the central question is, what are communities of color, immigrant communities, other systemically marginalized groups doing about the economic injustice they're facing? So, we're talking about the groups who are living or surviving the problem. What are they doing about it in response? And economic democracy shows up because it turns out it's a lot of what they're doing. And a lot of them have been doing it for a very long time. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about credit unions. Credit unions have been around for more than 100 years in this country. There's a much longer history of what we might today call credit unions around the world. Cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives in particular, or housing cooperatives. You might think of them as newer things, but actually, no, cooperative economics has been around for at least 150 years in this country, starting with a lot of emancipated slaves or even escaped slaves before the Civil War, who made it to the North and found cooperative economic ways to do things together. So there's a deep history of economic democracy in this country that we don't have to talk about. I won't get too much more into it here. So, it just turns out with this central question that I had, economic democracy just becomes part of the beat that I have in terms of it's what a lot of these communities are doing. Not just by themselves, but with their leadership and putting them at the forefront and others kind of coming along for the ride, so to speak. I also want to say, it's also called about my own personal interests. So Aria mentioned how, economic democracy cuts across so many different sectors, so many different potential beats, from health to labor, to real estate, finance, food for sure. As we get into some of the next slides, you'll start to see what is clearly my own kind of personal interest, and it gives me the way to kind of pick out or find the stories that I want to write about. Because within this like big economic democracy bucket, I use my own personal interest to give me a way of navigating and finding stories and just, filtering out what I want to spend my time doing. So with the next slide. So the next couple slides are organized into 3 buckets. So there's money, land, and labor. And so this is the money slide. These are just examples of the different credit union stories I've been able to do over the years at Next City. This one on the left that just came out on Tuesday about a tiny credit union in the Bronx. This credit union is under 10 million in assets. Most credit unions with less than 10 million assets do not do small business lending. This credit union just started doing it, and they've already got 1/3 of their portfolio in small business credit and small business lending. It's in the South Bronx. And so this is an example of the credit union stories you can do. Not just credit unions, there's also loan funds. There's a Boston Lattimore project in Boston is a loan fund where everybody who's a member of the project, all the members are working class residents of color of Boston. All the members of the project vote on every investment that gets made out of this fund. And do I have a public banking story? Oh, I do have some public bank stories in here. So public banking, this is the idea of having government-owned banks, whether it's municipally owned or state-owned banks. There's one in North Dakota, and there are campaigns all over the country from coast to coast who are trying to create more of these municipal and or state-owned banks that would help influence the larger banking sector to do more of what communities want, especially communities of color that are fighting for a lot of these public banks. Next slide, I'm going to rush through. Next slide. So this is the land slide. Rather than give you a whole bunch of different stories about different, there's a bunch of these that I could have brought up, but I'm just going to bring up one. The East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative in Oakland. They started out back in organizing efforts, maybe 2017, 2018. There was a group called the People of Color Sustainable Housing Network in Oakland, POSHN for short, it's a really cool acronym. And POSHN started working with the Sustainable Economies Law Center, which is in Oakland. And they got together, the organizers and the lawyers got together, and they created this new co-op thing. I won't say too much more about it, but basically this first story is when they bought their first building. It's about buying their first building. The second story is about buying their first commercial building. So it started with a residential building. The second story is a commercial building. And then the third story is about the first time they actually paid back to their investors. So they've been kind of investment crowdfunding, raising capital from investors, mostly in California and on the West Coast, but really all over the country to invest in this idea of owning and managing real estate collectively and intentionally for the benefit of communities of color in Oakland. Next slide. And this last one. So I mentioned, if you haven't guessed it already, my own personal interests. I like to write about banks and credit unions and finance and investment. And I bring that to wherever to this beat, even when I'm writing about worker-owned cooperatives. And I'm talking with worker-owned cooperatives about why are you using this model? Where did you first hear about this model? What resources have you gotten to help you through creating a worker-owned cooperative in your city or in your neighborhood? I just visited the grand opening of the first worker-owned cooperative cocktail bar in New York City. It opened last week, and it's called Donna. It used to be in Brooklyn, and it used to be conventionally owned, and it converted to worker-owned, and it moved from Brooklyn to the Village. And anyway, you can kind of see here that even when I write about worker-owned cooperatives, I often write about how are they getting access to capital to do the startup or to do the conversion. And there's an example down here on the right of sometimes there's overlap between it's literally a worker-owned cooperative and a community land trust in Oakland came together to buy a building. And for us at Next City, that was just a very clear, that's just a headline for the whole story. Next slide. They asked me so for the 4 pillars, I mean, basically, to sum this slide up, the 4 pillars just are helpful for me to just structure the story often, so these economic democracy stories, whether it's a credit union or some kind of community land trust or some kind of investment fund or some kind of worker-owned cooperative, it's not going to solve that one cooperative or that one credit union is not going to solve wage inequality or inequality in access to capital. It's not going to address climate change by itself. But you're looking at a little piece of the problem that the sources of the characters in that story are trying to address. So like, we're not going to solve the exploitation of labor with one worker-owned cooperative, but if we can show and we can help more worker-owned cooperatives get out there into the food and beverage industry, which is notoriously exploitative of labor, we can show that, if there's another way of doing all this stuff, there's another way of being a restaurant, another way of being a bar. There's a lot of worker-owned cooperatives popping up now in Baltimore, in part because it was one of the first worker-owned kind of cooperative bars, restaurants was Red Emma's, which is now 20 years old. It's a book, started out as a bookstore, now it's also a cafe and restaurant. And anyway, the fact that it was there 20 years, it's been there 20 years means there's been a lot of others in Baltimore who just like visit and see and realize, oh shoot, we can do this a different way. Not a lot of evidence you're going to find out there in terms of like, okay, again, one cooperative, probably not going to solve wage inequality, but there is data that shows workers and worker-owned cooperatives earn more. I mean, some of this by definition, right? Because part of the worker-owned cooperative is at the end of the year, if there are profits, those profits get distributed to the workers. So you're going to get more compensation in that way. If you have more worker-owned cooperatives in the neighborhood, does it make the neighborhood better for Black folks or brown folks? I don't know. I'd love to see that kind of study, but that kind of study isn't out there yet, in part because there's probably not enough worker-owned cooperatives in any neighborhood to really give that study the kind of robustness that it deserves. So it's hard to find evidence for these things. That's okay. It doesn't have to limit your reporting on it. I'll go to the next slide to wrap up. Just on sourcing. So I do use the word networking, but I mean, it's really relationship building. There are national, regional, and local convenings of these various components of economic democracy. There are credit union groups in every state. There are worker-owned cooperative groups now emerging in different states and different cities. U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, the National Cooperative Business Association, Inclusive, which is a national association of community development credit unions. They've got members everywhere, and you can go through these associations to get to local members if you're looking for local members. You can also go through these organizations for a lot of background info. And then, yeah, the last thing I'll say is no business or project is an island. When you come across one of these economic democracy stories, especially when it comes to economic democracy, if you just think about it as, oh, this is a real estate thing. It's community land trust, but really what it is a not only a housing developer, but it's a housing developer. As a land trust, it also needs capital. It needs lawyers. It needs accountants. It needs everything out that a traditional affordable housing developer needs. A community land trust needs that and more to get its work done. And each of those other characters in the story for that land trust is potentially another story for you. The lawyers are a big one, right? Like the lawyers that work with the organizers in Oakland to create the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. Those lawyers at the Sustainable Economy Law Center, they do all kinds of other things in solidarity and economic democracy kind of work. They're attached to so many other projects. Lawyers are a good one. Banks, credit unions are another good one. Their credit unions are funding worker-owned cooperatives in different cities. And housing cooperatives in different cities. And so that's another way in. And yeah, I think that's it. I'm excited for some more questions from the audience.
Oscar, thank you so much. That was a expert level rundown of all the great work you've been doing and giving insight, really important insight into how journalists can connect with and interface with, all the new economy things that are happening in their cities, because it's probably happening no matter where you are. And we're turning it over to our last but not least speaker. Ashton Lattimore is the editor-in-chief of Prism and a former lawyer. Her work sits at the intersection of racial justice, journalism, and the law. And if you aren't already familiar with Prism, it is one of the vital shining lights of journalism in this moment. And if you don't subscribe to their newsletter, read their stuff, you should definitely do it. Ashton, turning it over to you.
Thank you. I was just asking for permission to unmute. Thank you so much for that great introduction. Very excited to be here with all of you. So yeah, I'm actually here to share a case study in both solutions reporting and what we at Prism kind of experienced as living out sort of the promise of collective decision-making in a way, which kind of stem from some of our own solutions reporting. So the background to this is that Prism, is a nonprofit independent newsroom led by and for, journalists of color. We have a small staff of about 15 people, and we report pretty heavily on labor and workers' rights, and we do a great deal of solutions reporting. So prior to this past year, we basically had sort of a normal work week. And then what happened was that our solutions reporting actually led to us kind of collectively deciding as sort of a community of journalists together to adopt a 4-day work week. So I'm just going to take you through kind of a case study and kind of walk you through, first of all, how our solutions reporting kind of led to the change, and also how the solutions model informed the way that we made the decision in sort of a democratic participatory way. So I'll start here with this slide, and this is just the stories that kind of came out of this moment. So initially it was May, just about a year ago this week, we reported a story basically on how the 4-day work week, just as sort of a labor innovation, sort of a workers' rights innovation, is gaining momentum around the country, how, we're kind of seeing models get adopted in other countries, pilots being run, I think in the UK, I think Iceland, and some other places have done kind of collective nationwide sort of trials of a 4-day work week. And there's an increasing number of companies in the US that are experimenting with this and finding that the benefits for not just productivity, which is important, but not the most important thing, but also workers' lives, people's lives and their balance of work and life are seeing real improvements, measurable improvements. And you'll see about 4 months after we reported that story, we reported that Prism, we ourselves had adopted a 4-day work week. So I'll walk you back to the beginning and kind of show you how we kind of collectively made that decision. Next slide, please. So the backstory, so in summer 2020, kind of nudged by the pandemic and a lot of the sort of stress and burnout associated with people trying to juggle their lives and childcare and, illness and everything else, we actually experimented with adopting a 4-day work week using staggered schedules. So some people were Monday through Thursday, others were Tuesday through Friday. And that was just, strictly for the summer. And after that, we went back to a normal schedule. And then we settled on half-day Fridays as a kind of our status quo. So people would work 8 hours a day, Monday through Thursday. And then on Fridays, they would work for 4 hours. And that was really what we did straight through from 2020 to 2022. The other key piece of background is Prism has been reporting on workers' rights since 2020, including the workplace experiences of journalists like ourselves. So a lot of us are staff journalists and freelance journalists as well, and exploring the ways that people in newsrooms and workers outside of newsrooms have been organizing collectively to kind of improve the working experience for themselves. And then lastly, just as an organizational culture piece of things, from the beginning, Prism's been pretty focused on work-life balance, mental health, supporting staff as whole people. So with that foundation, it was a lot more sort of fertile ground for a radical shift like this to take root. Next slide, please. So the catalyst was the story that I pointed to in the first slide, reporting by Monse Reyes, a solution story that we actually did do as part of our labor cohort reporting, I believe. And just kind of evaluating the problem that the 4-day work week responds to, which especially became particularly pertinent after the pandemic or in the midst of the pandemic, when people just starting to feel overworked and feeling that a 4-day work week could be the answer to giving them better work-life balance and giving them more space to really breathe. So the study that our reporter found a 20% increase in productivity. People were saving time and money on their commute. There were mental health improvements. And crucially, these reduced barriers for employees who had caregiving responsibilities. So that's primarily women and people of color. So these actually 4-day work weeks, it looks like they have sort of follow-on diversity impacts, which is really something that matters a lot to us, particularly at Prism. Limitations. One of the big ones is that most of the companies who are trying out the 4-day work week are in tech, their finance, or other traditionally white collar industries. So far we've seen kind of limited adaptation of this, and it's not entirely clear that it would work in necessarily the same way for every single industry. So that's kind of an open question. And then of course there's the risk of kind of bad actors, where if companies allow people to adopt a 4-day work week, but then reduce their benefits accordingly because they're, quote, no longer full-time, and potentials for sort of abuse in that sense of things. And then the insights just got into how some of these companies adopted their 4-day work week. And what we saw mostly was that they started off pretty gradually, so sort of slow walking into it, by, maybe having shorter Fridays, meeting-free Fridays, quiet Fridays. So it wasn't so jarring just going from, literally 5 days, 40 hours a week, to just like right away cutting off a full day. Next slide, please. So the way that this story kind of came into sort of Prism's own ecosystem is, we reported the story, we published it, but for that to happen, only the editorial team really needs to have their hands on it, and really just the editor and the copy editor and the reporter. But the way that this piece kind of came into the attention of Prism's leadership, including myself and our COO who first noticed it, was just that we have kind of an RSS feed that shares all of our latest stories with the entire organization. We didn't do this with the intention of sparking kind of internal change based on our own reporting, but it is kind of a handy way to spark conversations, especially around workers' rights, on whether we're kind of living up to what we're sort of preaching in a certain way when we're reporting on workers' rights. Next slide, please. So rather than jumping into a permanent change to decide whether or not we wanted to adopt a 4-day work week, we put together a pilot to test it out and make a more informed decision once we had more data. I think the key thing to understand about the pilot is that this really was an act of collective decision-making. This wasn't something that me and Caitlin, our COO, were just going to decide top down, whether we like it or we don't like it, and this is just what we're going to do. We brought in the entire rest of the team and engaged everyone in designing the pilot and also assessing the pilot when it came to time to end it. So we set a finite length of time, 12 weeks, decided in advance how we would measure success. So that looked at like hard metrics such as story output, audience numbers, traffic, and then the soft metrics like work-life balance, impact, mental health. And we also looked at how we were going to evaluate those metrics. So some of them were fairly obvious audience metrics tools like publishing stats, social media engagement stats. But at the end, we circulated a qualitative staff survey asking people directly about how the 4-day workweek pilot had impacted their mental health, their productivity, their work-life balance. We gave space for narrative answers and any challenges that they'd encountered during the 4-day workweek pilot, any benefits that they'd seen from it. And then finally, just like a straight up kind of up or down vote, yes or no question on whether or not they recommended we make a permanent shift to a 4-day workweek. And then also asked about anything else leadership could do to support the adjustment if we did end up going in that direction permanently. Next slide, please. So the results, the pilot was a resounding success. The team voted unanimously in favor of following through with adopting a 4-day work week permanently. The final decision did still rest with myself and Caitlin, but there was not really any kind of situation where we as people would have overruled the entire team if everybody, as they did, voted unanimously in favor of it. What was interesting for me, the holdout was someone that I didn't really expect, which is the holdout was me. I was the one person who was sort of reluctant to kind of make this a permanent change. And I had to do some sort of internal work to sort of work through that resistance. Some of which is just, we're a newsroom of all people of color. There's respectability politics to consider. Are people going to think we're not working enough? Are people going to think we're not serious? How am I going to explain this to the board? How am I going to explain this, to our funders? But I think what's been interesting is that structuring the pilot the way that we did, we had so much evidence that we could marshal in favor of the decision. There was literally no evidence really pointing to us doing anything else. So I think the fact that we kind of designed this pilot and made sure that we had metrics that we were looking for and reporting out against and holding ourselves accountable to made it that much easier to adopt this kind of as our internal solution. And in reporting this out, we actually did do a full write-up story about it. Some of that was just me sort of practicing, how I wanted to start talking about it and explaining it to kind of external stakeholders, but also that some of that was hoping to be kind of an example to other newsrooms who were open to making this kind of radical shift. Next slide, please. So basically the report out was actually a solutions journalism story, because the way that it was shaped was I started with, of course, the problem that we were setting up a response to, and then which is of course, burnout, especially among journalists, and then kind of got into the evidence of all of the stuff that we kind of collected from the survey results, the audience metrics, editorial workflow. So I reported out on what we found with all of those metrics, which were that we hit our production goals, we exceeded audience growth goals, our fundraising, continued an upward trajectory. And of course, team members reported improved work-life balance, mental health, saving money on childcare, kind of all the good things that you would expect to see from a pilot like this. We also shared the limitations, which were, some of them are just kind of a limitation based on what Prism is. We are a small newsroom, we're relatively new, so we don't have entrenched practices that would be difficult to shift in a moment like this. And also we don't do kind of the 24-hour news cycle, breaking news kind of stuff that would make it difficult for us to unplug for a full day every week. I think I accidentally left out the slide that had the response to the social problem and the insights, but the insights were basically the report out. This is me sharing the insights with everybody else outside of our newsroom. Next slide, please. And that is the way that the process came together. So I will pause there, and I think we are opening it up to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ashton, for sharing that incredible journey and actually applying the process to the newsroom, and that's really fascinating. So thank you for sharing that with us, and we'll link more information to this in our resource we send out after the presentation. I wanted to also introduce my colleague, Angela Evans, who's the labor cohort manager for this final section of question and answer. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A. And I'm going to start with the question for Ashton. Tell us why Prism and Next City came together to create Solutions for Economic Equity partnership, which highlights how low-income and marginalized BIPOC communities are cultivating, building, and seizing economic justice in cities across the U.S. Oh, and I believe you should be able to unmute now. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Yeah, so something that is really central to the way Prism reports the news, and I think the way that Next City reports the news as well, is a really strong focus on agency of people in impacted communities to make changes for themselves, because they are the experts on their own lived experiences. So, with Next City and Prism both being outlets that are really dedicated to solutions reporting, we saw an opportunity here for Prism to kind of bring our resources and our particular focus on BIPOC communities throughout the United States, and for Next City to bring in their incredible expertise on urban reporting and urban communities to really take sort of a really focused look at the ways that BIPOC communities within cities are working toward economic justice. So we put together this partnership and reported several really exciting stories just about people kind of taking the reins of solving problems within their own areas and trying to amplify this work so that people in other cities who maybe have similar kind of issues can feel sort of empowered and have a blueprint for ways that they can adopt similar solutions.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashton. I love this partnership about solutions that y'all just did on your own outside of any work with SJN. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela, as Jessel said, and I'm going to be asking some questions that we got in the Q&A. So first up, this is for Oscar, but Ashton and Aria, feel free to answer as well. Have you seen cooperative solutions bringing younger people and older people to solve together to solve problems around economic opportunity? And if so, what have you seen?
Yes. It can happen either at a board member level, community land trusts bringing together, older residents in the community with younger residents. It can also happen just at the kind of membership kind of level. So not board members, but the folks who are who are part of a community land trust or maybe a credit union too, coming together across different generations to be part of managing and governing and making decisions about some of these for each entity. So yeah, in organizing networks, or oftentimes in the governance of an economic democracy kind of entity, you see folks of all different ages coming together. I guess maybe one of the really fascinating ones, or like most concrete examples, is in New York City. There's one community land trust. It's called Cooper Square. It's been around. The organizing behind this goes back to the 60s, like the Fighting Robert Moses, and you have some of the organizers and leaders behind it who are still around, and they're kind of, they're not able to do as much as they used to, or some of them have even moved on to work with other community land trusts in the city, and have kind of left the organizing work to some of the younger staff or younger residents who are there. It's not always intentional, so to speak, like intentionally creating an intergenerational entity, but it happens in part because people of different generations, if they live in the same neighborhood, or if they go to the same credit union, or if they're working on cooperatives and there's different workers of different ages who are just working together to form that cooperative. It happens.
Yeah, and I'd love to add to that. So the question of youth in cooperatives and cooperative movements is really a passion of mine. And there are a variety of places that this shows up in the US and abroad. And one of the leading voices in this conversation is Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemhard, who is the kind of authority on, she wrote the book on the history of Black economic cooperation in the United States, and she gained a lot of kind of fame for this particular book, this history. But before she wrote this book, she had done a ton of writing on the role of cooperatives in youth development, and the ways in which cooperatives in schools and cooperative entrepreneurship training could both support educational outcomes for youth in marginalized communities, as well as economic outcomes and community outcomes. So she has a lot to say about the value of youth engagement in cooperative projects and learning. And then in the UK, there was recently a study about how, kind of youth are orienting towards co-ops. And something that's really important about that work is it points to the role that co-ops play in offering a sense of hope for young people who are incredibly disillusioned with the vision of civic engagement, the idea of workforce, and their kind of career options. And so the kind of mental health impacts on youth around learning about co-ops and getting to practice these alternative ways of organizing economic life is a huge, I think, piece of the puzzle that I would love to see more of in the US. And so outside of this particular work, one thing that I'm working on is an initiative that begins to pull together all of the folks who are organizing for youth-based cooperative education, or economic democracy education with youth and in schools. And so there are a peppering of projects and initiatives around the country that I would be happy to share with anybody who is interested in that.
Awesome, thanks. We had another question that came through about kind of, it comes back to your point, Oscar, just about financing, access to capital, and also what happens, the evidence there for when people need to, maybe sell their share or sell a building that's been purchased cooperatively, and if that's been a big limitation in what you've seen.
Yes and no. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which finance most of the residential mortgage market in the US together, they do offer products that are tailored to or work specifically for community land trusts. You know, loan products for a resident to buy a share in the co-op or to buy a piece of buy community land trust housing, if that's the model that the land trust is using. The challenge is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, while they're big entities, they don't make the loans themselves. So there may or may not be a private lender, a community bank, or a credit union, most likely nearby, that it knows how to make those kinds of loans using the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae backing. So, I mean, if there is, I mean, I would go through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to find one of those lenders near you. If there isn't one near you, it'll be really interesting to, I mean, that's a story there to kind of think about. Well, we have some folks who are creating co-ops over here, and there is a federal level solution for the share loans. They're called share loans, but there's no one locally who provides that product. You know, that's potentially a story.
Yeah, thanks. I know it's there are limitations, right? That's a pillar of solutions journalism, and this question raises a key limitation that gets to continue being figured out as we dive deeper into a solution. I'm going to end here. You can probably hear the church bells in the background at my house. But we had an interesting question to end, and I would love to kind of get everyone's thoughts on it real quick. It's this idea of solutions journalism and economic democracy going hand in hand. Back to Aria's point about the responses are really based in the community, and what the people closest to the problems have a lot of the answers, but that doesn't often make it into the mainstream, both through solutions reporting and also some of these ideas. Obviously, we're all working on that by reporting on these stories, covering things through a solutions lens, but how do you kind of see more of these ideas taking root in your communities, as well as this concept of solutions journalism really covering them? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'm happy to kick it off and then pass it over. So like I said, I think I'm particularly passionate about where these ideas begin to be incorporated in educational spaces, whether it's with adults, whether it's through, CDCs, right, community development corporations, other providers who provide services for entrepreneurs, potential entrepreneurs, high school students, community colleges. I see there being so much opportunity to share these models and this knowledge with folks who are in the position of starting their own things or carving out their own paths. And I think there is a kind of role to play for solutions journalists to, even if there's just one project happening in your town, to make that visible for others so that then folks can continue to expand their sense of what is possible, right? And be informed by that as they continue to make their own choices about what they're going to build. So there's a lot of challenges related to how these stories proliferate and how we address the kind of gap in knowledge about these topics and these models, which is, by the way, by design. These are powerful solutions, and a lot of folks have reasons to not want folks to know about them. So lifting out the people who have taken on those models over the last 100 years, over the last 5 years, over the last year, and sharing that with community is a pretty significant act wherever it can be kind of proliferated.
And I'll add, for one thing, so solutions that don't work get reported in mainstream media all the time. Solutions that come from racism or ideology, that have no, they're not coming from lived experience, such as work requirements in the social safety net. There's so much evidence that it doesn't work. It doesn't force more, people who are on social safety net to work more. It doesn't make life better. It doesn't help people get out of poverty if there are work requirements in the social safety net. Since we put work requirements back into the social safety net after the pandemic, things have gotten worse. And when we took work requirements off the social safety net during the pandemic, or we reduced them, things got better. But that didn't matter in mainstream media, right? So here's what I would say. Here's why I would say it's important to report on these solutions, especially these economic democracy solutions, these solutions that are rooted in or coming out of BIPOC communities. The reason is, for the most part, mainstream media only reports on these communities when something goes wrong, when there's a murder, when there's a rise in crime, when there's something terrible that happens in these communities. That's when mainstream media reports on it. If you watch the 11 o'clock news every night, that's all you'll hear in every city across the country, at least the cities I've been to. All right. So if most people only hear about these communities as being chaos, crime, drug-ridden, and terrible, number one, they'll think, oh, these are terrible communities and the people there need to move out, or they're bad, or they're immoral, or whatever, which is not true. And number two, you're giving license to policymakers to just go out there and take whatever solutions they think and go into those neighborhoods and fix it, like police. There's so much crime. We need to send more police into these neighborhoods. Never works. Never, ever works. But they do it anyway. On the other hand, what if we took some of those police budgets and put it into community land trusts, put it into worker-owned cooperatives, and created not just real opportunities or better opportunities, but created momentum behind the ideas and the businesses that the folks in these communities are already putting their time and effort into putting together. You know how hard it is to start a credit union? It can take years, but folks will still keep pushing for it, because in these communities, you know, on the north side of Minneapolis, there's a group that's been trying to put together a new credit union in the predominantly Black north side of Minneapolis for almost 10 years now. I mean, since the killing of Philando Castile, like way before the pandemic, way before George Floyd, they've been trying to put this credit union together. And they're still doing it. Why? Because it's what they want, and they feel like this is part of what we need to address the bigger problem of structural oppression facing our neighborhood, facing our city. And, you know, again, if you only hear about the north side of Minneapolis because there's a rise in crime or car thefts or murders or whatever, and you don't hear about, oh, actually the folks in those neighborhoods are trying to do something about it, what becomes your image of those communities? You know, that's really the case I make for, like, not just solutions-oriented reporting, but reporting on these solutions in particular that are rooted in these communities. Someone's got to do it. It's why I became a journalist. And I'm just glad that I have the platform that I have at Next City to do it.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Let's turn it over to Ashton to close us out.
Sure. I don't know if I'm questioning the premise of like how you make solutions journalism mainstream, but I think much of mainstream legacy journalism is not just invested in the status quo. It's sort of an active agent of the status quo, whereas solutions journalism as a concept, especially when you're talking about solutions journalism focused on communities of color, is inherently disruptive to a lot of what's convenient and comfortable to many of the people who run sort of mainstream and legacy news organizations. So I think part of what we need to start thinking about is sort of democratizing our view of what journalism is legitimate, what what does it mean when an outlet that's outside of what's, quote, the mainstream is doing really serious, rigorous reporting, solutions reporting on people of color, communities of color? Do they need to become mainstream in order for that work to have value? Or at some point, can we just hope that there are enough outlets like that out in the world that we can sort of overwhelm the narrative that the mainstream sort of has been pushing for, since the beginning of time? So I don't know that solutions journalism will ever become mainstream, but I do believe that at some point there will be enough of us sort of outside the mainstream that there'll be sort of a counterbalance, a much needed counterbalance.
Couldn't think of a more powerful note to end this really wonderful discussion on. I want to thank our panelists, Aria, Oscar, Ashton, and special thanks to Angela for helping this come together as our convener today. You have our emails listed in the slide. And if you signed up for this webinar, you will get a follow-up email with resources. Thank you all for participating and joining us today and for the great questions. Bye-bye.